Greetings, this is Greg. During World War II, the first U.S. fighter plane to have really long range was the P-38 Lightning. P-38s were the first fighters to fly across the Atlantic, which is impressive. Most single and twin-engine combat planes at that point could only be sent across by ship. In April of '43, Lightnings famously flew on Operation Vengeance. This was the mission to kill Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Operation Vengeance required P-38s to fly 600 miles to the target in sort of a roundabout way to avoid enemy contact, then have enough fuel for the fight and the 400-mile return leg. The Lightnings flown on this mission were G models, which didn't even have the increased fuel capacity seen in the later models, which started from around mid to late 1943. Furthermore, the G models on Operation Vengeance didn't even have optimal drop tanks. They had to fly with an asymmetrical loadout because they didn't have enough of the big drop tanks to put two on each airplane, so they flew with one big one and one smaller one. I want to add, this was not a one-time mission the planes could barely do and were lucky to complete. Lightnings flew essentially the same route a number of times in the weeks after Operation Vengeance in order to hide the fact that the U.S. knew where and when Admiral Yamamoto would be. By flying the same mission over and over, it appeared to the Japanese that the U.S. had simply started a new patrol route, one with, for them, very unfortunate timing, and not that the U.S. had broken the Japanese code and actually knew Admiral Yamamoto's itinerary. Now, over in the European theater, on March 3, 1944, P-38s were the first fighters over Berlin, as seen in this document from the History of the 8th Air Force Fighter Command. A lot of people think the P-51 was first over Berlin. Not true. Although the P-51s were over Berlin only 3 days later, they were not first. In fact, for most of 1943, before the P-51 Mustangs showed up, and before the P-47 Thunderbolts had decent drop tanks in significant numbers in theater, the P-38 was the only Allied fighter with enough range to escort deep into Germany. Now that goes against the standard World War II narrative, which is that until the P-51 Mustang with the Merlin engine showed up, no U.S. fighter had the range to escort into Germany. That's a false narrative. The very existence of the P-38 Lightning destroys it, which is probably why the P-38's range is rarely discussed. Compare that with seemingly every single book or documentary about the P-51 Mustang in which they won't shut up about the plane's range and often incorrectly claim it was the first or even the only fighter that could escort U.S. bombers deep into Germany. I think it's time for the Lightning to get some coverage on the subject of range, as I have other videos looking at the Lightning's performance as well as the pros and cons of its design. In this video, I'm going to focus heavily on range. The Lightning was designed in response to the Army's Circular Proposal X-608. I've never found the actual wording of that proposal, but I do know that it focused heavily on speed, climb rate, and weapons load. There seems to have been at least some thought given to fuel capacity. In Warren Bodie's excellent book on the P-38, he talks about an alternative fuel load that was looked at, giving the plane around 370 gallons of internal fuel. That's more or less consistent in what I see from other secondary sources, and it makes sense. You should also note that Bodie points out both the Army Air Corps policy and the contract itself prohibited external fuel tanks. That's going to matter a lot later in this video, especially as it relates to the Bomber Mafia stuff. Now, 370 gallons of internal fuel sounds pretty good, but by the time they built an actual combat-ready airplane with self-sealing tanks, that fuel capacity was reduced. Self-sealing tanks for a given amount of external volume can't hold as much as non-self-sealing tanks. They have to give up some of that internal volume to make room for the self-sealing stuff. The first P-38 variant, which was a true combat-ready airplane, was the P-38E, E as in Echo. These came out in October of 1941, just before U.S. entry into the Second World War. The E model carried 306 gallons of internal fuel and had no provisions for external drop tanks. 306 gallons, sometimes it's listed as 300 gallons, was a decent amount for a fighter at the time. But of course, it has two engines burning that fuel. But to put it into perspective, the P-39 Airacobra, which only has one Allison V12, had only 120 gallons for its single engine. The Curtiss P-40 had 146 gallons, and the Spitfire Mark V had only 102 gallons. The P-47 Thunderbolt, which was not yet in service at this point, would carry 305 gallons of internal fuel when introduced, about the same as the Lightning. Remember, we're comparing early versions of each airplane here. Both would get more internal fuel later, and I'll talk about that. While both the Lightning and Thunderbolt carried about the same amount of fuel, the P-38 had two engines. However, the Thunderbolt's engine was larger and less fuel efficient. It's remarkable how close the two planes are in range when on internal fuel. Now, I'm just going to take numbers here straight from the pilot manuals. I fully realize these don't take into account every possible variable, but as the numbers I'm using are from official manuals and they are all calculated the same way, the numbers are valid for comparison. I'll use numbers for 9,000 feet of altitude because it's a point common to all of the charts. Starting with the P-38 at its most fuel-efficient power setting listed in the manual, we have a maximum range on internal fuel of 870 miles. That's at a true airspeed of 220 miles per hour and at a fuel flow for both engines combined of 58 gallons per hour. The P-39 Airacobra is quite efficient. At 9,000 feet, its true airspeed for maximum range will give it 230 miles per hour on 32 gallons per hour. It has slightly more than half of the P-38's rate of fuel consumption, but it's also going slightly faster under these conditions. However, it doesn't have a lot of fuel, and its range is only 640 miles. The P-40 is interesting. It can go 700 miles, a little farther than the P-39, but it uses quite a bit more fuel to do it. Its true airspeed will be 209 miles per hour on the same fuel flow as the P-39, and will be burning 32 gallons per hour, the same as the 39. This shows how efficient the P-39 was, but it was held back here, so to speak, by its lack of internal fuel capacity. So in late 1941, the P-38's range was pretty good compared to other U.S. fighters, and a whole lot better than the typical European fighters. Spitfires, 109s, and Yaks are so far behind, I'm not going to bother putting them on the chart. I'll add in the P-47 Thunderbolt, but keep in mind it came out about a year later. A late 1942 Thunderbolt will go about 880 miles, about the same as the Lightning, just 10 miles more on this chart. The Thunderbolt will be going 240 miles per hour and burning 65 gallons per hour. So the Thunderbolt's single engine burns about the same as the P-38's two engines, not exactly, but pretty close. Here is a chart to summarize all of this. Keep in mind, again, these are late 1941 versions of each airplane except the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, which is a late 1942 airplane. That's when it entered service. And I thought it should be included here because until late 43, the Lightning and Thunderbolt were the only two U.S. fighters in service with significant high-altitude capability. In other words, the Thunderbolt is the only plane here that can be reasonably compared with the Lightning for bomber escort duties or other duties requiring flight at high altitudes. The miles per gallon numbers are simply calculated by taking the distance and dividing it by the airplane's internal fuel capacity. Actual miles per gallon while in cruise will be better. For our metric friends, I included the distances in kilometers and the conversion factors for the other numbers if you want to do the math. I know it seems like a bit of a waste of time to include the metric numbers. There are roughly 195 countries in the world, sometimes slightly more, sometimes slightly less. Some countries exist sometimes and not at other times, and some are not counted, even though they are real countries. Anyway, of those roughly 195 countries, only 2 or 3 use the metric system in aviation, and sometimes only certain parts of those countries. Parts of Russia, parts of China use it. Everyone else, with the exception of sailplanes, blimps, and some weird things like that, everyone else uses feet for altitude and knots for speed. So for you last few holdouts using meters and kilometers, I have you covered here. Back to our story. In short, if comparing all of these planes without drop tanks, both the P-38 and the P-47 have pretty good range for the time, but still not nearly long enough for the long-range missions of the Pacific, let alone to escort bombers deep into Germany. The obvious answer was to add drop tanks, but there was a strong prohibition against drop tanks, which came from Hap Arnold himself, head of the Army Air Corps, soon to be the Army Air Force. Hap Arnold and the other members of the Bomber Mafia were true believers in the idea of unescorted bombers. Thus, they didn't see the need for long-range escort fighters, at least not in 1939. Now, when evaluating a politician, and nobody makes it to general or admiral without at least some political skill, so this applies to them too, you can't judge these people entirely by what they say. You have to judge them by what they actually do. Hopefully any adult watching this video already knows that. I'm bringing this up because you can find some documents that suggest some in the U.S. Army were looking into drop tanks, and some were, but these were people who could not overrule Hap Arnold, or the high-ranking officers in the Bomber Mafia. That's obvious when you look at what the Army Air Force actually did. They came up with some roadblock to drop tank production at every turn. On the other hand, they spent money like drunken sailors on crazy bomber projects like the YB-40, a heavily armed escort B-17 to escort B-17 heavy bombers. They also had a program to use B-26s to escort B-17s. The B-26 didn't have anywhere near the altitude capability to do that. Neither of these half-baked ideas worked out, but both show what the AAF actually did rather than just what they talked about doing. Often the way politicians prevent someone from doing something is by putting up roadblocks that basically make it impossible, even if not downright illegal. That way they stop you. But if it turns out the wrong way politically, they have a certain amount of plausible deniability. When it all goes pear-shaped, they can still say, I didn't make that illegal, I didn't stop you. That's the tactic the Bomber Mafia took in 1941 and 1942. Let's take a look at these roadblocks and, more importantly, see how Lockheed got around them for the P-38 Lightning when Republic aircraft really couldn't do it effectively for the P-47 Thunderbolt. Let's start off with this document from 1939 in which Hap Arnold says no to drop tanks on tactical aircraft. He does allow for Curtiss to develop a tank at their own expense, which of course any company could do anyway. But it's clear here that under Hap Arnold, who was the man in charge, the U.S. Army Air Corps would not be paying for drop tanks, and the buck stopped with him. Now, you can find documents from lower-ranking officers that suggest drop tanks might be a good idea, or perhaps should be looked into and tested. Occasionally, you see someone referencing these documents in defense of the Bomber Mafia, saying, see, they did want drop tanks. No, those sort of documents do not trump Hap Arnold's edict. He was the man at top, and his policies were controlling, not merely suggestions. Again, you really need to look beyond the documents at what they actually did or didn't do. You still need to look at the documents, but you need to keep the big picture in mind. That 1939 memo from Hap Arnold is echoed in other documents. I want to stress this was in 1939. By this point, drop tanks were well proven in both the Spanish Civil War and the Second Sino-Japanese War. There really is no excuse for a high-ranking officer in the AAF not understanding the potential usefulness of drop tanks. But that's where the U.S. found itself. However, many in the U.S., including Hap Arnold, and quite a few others in the Bomber Mafia, were blinded by their devout belief in the bomber doctrine. As seen here, that 1939 memo just about stopped drop tank development in the U.S. 2 years later, in 1941, Lockheed started to look into them and found there was a lack of agreement in the AAF on drop tanks. And of course there was. Everyone in the AAF wasn't in lockstep on this, but Hap Arnold and his Bomber Mafia didn't want them, at least not for escort purposes. And remember, the buck stopped with Arnold, at least in relationship to this issue. Lockheed was trying to get answers about whether drop tanks could be used for ferrying or high-altitude escort work, but they really couldn't get anywhere. Let's talk about some of the other roadblocks. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, a serious effort was started to look into drop tanks made from alternative materials, meaning not metal. It was claimed that metal drop tanks would create a serious risk of explosion if hit in combat. There is truth to that. If hit by enemy fire, a conventional non-self-sealing metal drop tank can ignite, and that did happen on some rare occasions during the war. It was rare because, of course, fighters would normally drop their tanks before engaging in combat. Of course, a tank that can catch fire or explode is not desirable, but there was a war on. Losing an occasional fighter to this hazard seems minor compared to the losses incurred by using unescorted bombers because of the lack of drop tanks. Of course, at this point, which is early 1942, the members of the Bomber Mafia are still fully immersed in their self-escorting bomber delusions. The next roadblock came up in 1942, which was the idea that drop tanks should be able to double as bombs. A lot of time and energy was spent on this, which could have been much better used simply to get drop tanks onto the airplanes. At this point, I should say that there were 75-gallon conventional metal drop tanks in production for P-39s and P-40s, but those planes lacked the altitude and range capabilities to escort U.S. four-engine bombers, thus were not a threat to the Bomber Mafia doctrine. The next roadblock was the idea that drop tanks should be leak-proof, aka self-sealing tanks. This idea was holding things up in early 1943 and continued being an issue at least through August of that year. But one of the biggest roadblocks was the prohibition on pressurizing, aka supercharging the drop tanks. An external fuel tank on a high-altitude fighter will need some way to ensure that fuel feeds at low ambient air pressure values found at high altitudes. The easiest way to do this with a drop tank is to pressurize the fuel tank with air from one of the aircraft systems. There were other potential roadblocks as well. There was quite a bit of debate about how drop tanks could be shipped in large numbers. One potential solution proposed in 42 was to use collapsible drop tanks. All this and more made it very hard for any manufacturer to tool up to build suitable drop tanks for long-range bomber escort missions on P-38s or P-47s. For example, it would have been very easy to make a pressurized, non-self-sealing metal tank that didn't need to double as a bomb, but it would have been a big financial risk for Lockheed or Republic because they couldn't really tell which way the winds were blowing. I don't want to go too far into the P-47 side of the story. I've beat that to death in other videos. But the short version is that Republic, probably in an effort to adapt to the ever-changing requirements, designed and built several drop tanks for the Thunderbolt starting in mid-1942, including a 200-gallon drop tank, and this tank is just what I described. It could feed at high altitude, was non-self-sealing, not a bomb, and made out of metal. The U.S. Army Air Force just didn't buy it. The tank they did buy for the Thunderbolt was Republic's ungainly appearing ferry tank that was made out of compressed paper. I think of it as the bullfrog tank because Thunderbolt ace Francis Gabreski said it looked like a bullfrog mid-croak. This tank was just fine for ferry flights, but it had no internal baffles to prevent fuel from sloshing around during even mild maneuvering, or any way to feed fuel at high altitudes. Thus, it could be used for ferrying, but it would be ineffective for bomber escort work, at least as that sort of work was envisioned at the time. In other words, it was acceptable to the Bomber Mafia, so that's the tank they bought. The Thunderbolt did eventually get decent drop tanks, but in Europe not in large numbers until late 1943, after the Luftwaffe had already caused huge losses to unescorted U.S. bombers, forcing the Bomber Mafia into a come-to-Jesus moment. Again, that saga is well covered on this channel. So the question is, how did Lockheed get around these roadblocks? Well, they had some aces up their sleeve. First of all, the U.S. Navy had aircraft, and they didn't have any prohibition on drop tanks. In fact, they wanted them. Not only that, the British wanted them as well, and Lockheed happened to be making a powerful twin-engine airplane that was desired by both the U.S. Navy and the British Royal Air Force. That plane was the Lockheed PV-1 Ventura. Because they knew they could sell drop tanks with or without the U.S. Army, Lockheed was able to tool up and build 165-gallon metal, non-self-sealing pressurized tanks for the Ventura, and these could be easily adapted to the P-38 Lightning. Another ace up the sleeve was the reconnaissance version of the P-38. It was maybe not prohibited from carrying drop tanks, or at least in a gray area. That meant that Lockheed had customers willing to pay for the tanks and a version of the P-38 they could reasonably put the tank on. That brings us to a gentleman named Benjamin Kelsey. He was a very accomplished pilot. He held several aviation records, probably flew more types of U.S. fighters than any other pilot in history. His list of accomplishments are too long to go into here. As a lieutenant, Kelsey was quite involved in the design proposal, Circular X608, that led to the construction of the P-38 Lightning. Instead of calling it a pursuit aircraft, which is what they called fighters back then, Kelsey called it an interceptor to get around Army Air Corps restrictions on weight of armament. Interceptor was not a term in use at the time for U.S. aircraft, so there were no restrictions on it. That foreshadows the type of thinking Kelsey would use for the drop tank issue. He was aware from very early on that the P-38s would need drop tanks, but with the prohibition on them from up high in the chain of command, he had to be a little careful or even deceptive about how he went about making this happen. Thankfully, we have a lot of information on this from a book he wrote, which was published in 1982. The title is in reference to a Greek myth about dragon's teeth, which were thrown into the soil from which sprang armed soldiers. In the book, he describes a discussion with Lockheed and Republic, in which he suggests they start developing drop tanks, but without a contract and without compensation. Apparently, Republic Aircraft balked at the idea. I'm sure they did initially. This was before the P-47 even had its first flight. I doubt they would want to go against a decree from Hap Arnold on the word of an Army Air Force captain who was clearly doing this on the down low, let alone do it for no compensation and possibly risk their whole program. My initial reaction, and I suspect yours, would have been to balk at this as well. However, once the P-47 was flying, Republic did design a number of drop tanks for the P-47, including 3 different 200-gallon tanks to try and anticipate what the military would want. They built a 200-gallon metal drop tank that, as far as I can tell, never went anywhere and was certainly never purchased. They also built a 200-gallon tank made out of vulcanized fiberboard with internal baffles and with a wind-driven pump to ensure performance at very high altitudes without breaking the rule about no pressurizing tanks. This tank went so far as to pass all material command testing, but was never purchased. Then, of course, there was the Bullfrog tank, which we already covered. The fact that Republic actually made a tank that could have been used for escort work, probably 2 of them, but the AAF bought the one that really couldn't, says a lot about their true motivations. Back to Lockheed, they accepted Kelsey's proposal, and probably for a few reasons. First, they had been working with him since the very beginning of the P-38 program. Kelsey was a P-38 test pilot, very pro P-38, and I suspect Kelly Johnson, a head Lockheed engineer on the project, simply knew and trusted him. In fact, it seems the 2 of them were sort of in cahoots on this together, and I'll show evidence of that later. Another reason I think Lockheed accepted Kelsey's proposal right away is that the financial burden of developing and tooling up to build the tank itself could be shoved onto others like the U.S. Navy or the British, as it was going to be used on the PV-1 Ventura, as I mentioned earlier. At this time, Lockheed was working on an order for 188 of these planes for the British, and they wanted drop tanks as well. An interesting side note, the Ventura was a source of a bureaucratic battle between the U.S. Army Air Force and the U.S. Navy. The USAAF was operating them over the ocean doing anti-submarine work, which the Navy felt was clearly within their domain. However, the USAAF was very protective of their monopoly on large land-based bombers, and they felt that they had exclusive rights within the U.S. services to operate the Ventura, which they called the B-34. Basically, the USAAF felt that the Navy should be restricted to carrier-based aircraft, flying boats, and floatplanes. The Ventura is the plane that brought all of this to a head, and it still has ramifications today. The Navy found itself in a pretty good bargaining position here, as they had something the USAAF really wanted. That was the production facility in Renton, Washington, which the Army Air Force really needed for B-29 development and production. The Navy controlled the Renton facility and was using it for flying boat production, specifically the new Boeing Sea Ranger seen here. A deal was struck, and I don't know all the details, but the Sea Ranger was canceled. The Navy had another flying boat to take its place anyway. The USAAF got the Renton plant, and in exchange, the Navy got their Venturas, and as part of the deal, the U.S. Marine Corps was allowed to operate B-25s. Now that the Navy's use of Venturas was secured, plus the British were buying them, all of this meant there would be plenty of drop tanks needed for Venturas, so Lockheed designed and tooled up to build them. This statement from Dragon's Teeth clearly shows that in 1940, the official position of the USAAF was that they would not pay for drop tanks on fighters. I bring this up because occasionally you see someone in the comments referencing this very page in the book and saying, see, Greg, you're wrong. The USAAF, actually the Air Corps at the time, was developing drop tanks as early as 1940. It was Republic Aircraft that was against it. However, if you read the whole section, it just doesn't read that way. It's clear that the USAAF was not behind Kelsey's proposal. He had sort of gone rogue here. If you need more evidence of this, we can take a look inside Warren Bodie's excellent book on the P-38. In March of 1942, Arnold had been having dinner with some high-level folks in Washington, D.C., when someone seated near him asked how he planned to get all the planes over to Europe with the U-boat menace going on. The U-boat menace was pretty serious at this point in 1942. It may have been an off-the-cuff remark, we don't know, but Arnold said, "We'll just have to fly them over." 2 days later, President Roosevelt, having heard about this remark, put Arnold on the spot, asking him if this could really be done. We don't know exactly how Arnold responded to Roosevelt, but it is clear that at this point, he decided that he needed drop tanks on the P-38 for ferrying purposes. Not for bomber escort, mind you, but ferrying. He immediately contacted Benjamin Kelsey. I'm not sure how, but he figured out what Kelsey had been doing. I'm sure it was hard to keep such a project under wraps for any amount of time, but in any case, Kelsey was unmasked and had to admit his conspiracy with Kelly Johnson and Colonel Goddard. Conspiracy is the word Bodie uses in his book. I think it's a little harsh. If anything, I see Arnold and the Bomber Mafia as the conspirators in this story, but you can read this any way you want. With Kelsey and his drop tank project unmasked, the cat was totally out of the bag. It's fortunate for Kelsey, because people have been court-martialed for a lot less, so it's fortunate for Kelsey that this happened right at a time when Hap Arnold really needed those drop tanks to get himself out of a corner he had backed himself into. Drop tanks were simply needed to fly P-38s across the Atlantic to England. I mentioned Goddard a moment ago, so we need to go back and talk about him for a moment. Colonel Goddard had been trying to get a decent reconnaissance airplane built for a long time. He'd been doing this before U.S. entry into the war and had always run into brick walls. But in 1942, things were different, and his ideas were starting to get some traction. He spearheaded the development of the Lockheed F-4, which was the photo reconnaissance version of the P-38E. The F-4, and I almost hate calling it that because it brings up this image in my head, but whatever. The F-4 we're talking about here was going to need drop tanks in order to effectively do its job. Obviously, a reconnaissance airplane that can't get deep into enemy territory would be of limited value. Furthermore, Hap Arnold's prohibition on drop tanks applied to tactical aircraft. As Benjamin Kelsey points out in his book, the term tactical and strategic are misleading for aircraft because these terms actually describe the missions or type of employment used by the aircraft. So was the F-4 a tactical or a strategic airplane? I haven't found anything in a World War II document that says either way. I can say that after the war, when the U.S. Air Force was founded, they broke it up into various commands, and the reconnaissance aircraft were operated by the Strategic Air Command. Whatever the case, it was Kelsey who spearheaded the drop tank project on the P-38, with help from Goddard and various people at Lockheed. The first Lightnings to be equipped to carry drop tanks were the F-4 models in December of 1941. These were mostly P-38Es pulled off the assembly line during production and converted. A lot of work had to be done to make them into F-4s. That wasn't trivial. It's important to understand that the first P-38s to carry drop tanks were not fighters. They were reconnaissance airplanes. The P-38F was the first fighter to be equipped to handle drop tanks, and that was in April of 1942. That's before the P-47 Thunderbolt entered service. The drop tank Lockheed built was a 165-gallon all-metal pressurized tank. Pretty much everything the Bomber Mafia had been strongly against up until this point. We know from this article in a Period magazine that by June of 1943, Lockheed was tooled up to make these tanks. They were originally making them out of aluminum, which was expensive and time-consuming, but they switched to steel, and once tooled up for that, they were able to make over 300 of these tanks a day. They just had to be given the word to do so. These steel 165-gallon tanks were also built by various subcontractors. There was a big demand for them because a lot of planes used them. Some sources call them 150-gallon tanks. It's unclear if that's because the tanks from different contractors were slightly different or if it was just the way in which their capacity was rated. There were also some 300-gallon tanks being built, sometimes called 310-gallon. These were aluminum and always seemed to be in very short supply, especially before late 1944. There was also a plywood version of the 300-gallon tank. These were also rare. I'm not sure I've ever seen a picture of one. At this point, the P-38 could carry a large variety of drop tanks. It could easily handle an asymmetrical loadout, say a 165 on one side and a 300 on the other. Fortunately for Lockheed, The P-38 system for mounting the tanks, which was really a bomb mounting system, became the USAAF standard. This was a problem for Republic aircraft with their P-47 because it was designed to take a single large belly tank as large as 600 gallons for really long-range ferrying flights. There was also a 400-gallon tank developed, and of course the various 200-gallon tanks, which would have been fine for escort duty. We already talked about those. That meant the P-47 had to have a very strong mount, one capable of holding a 400 or even a 600-gallon drop tank. So that's what Republic designed. It would not hook up to the smaller tanks intended for other aircraft. The AAF then required to put the lighter duty mount onto the belly of the P-47 for standardization. Of course, this didn't solve the range problem because the only tank that would fit on that mount and fit under the belly of a Thunderbolt was the US 75-gallon tank, which was fine for a P-39, but not for a P-47. The British built a 108-gallon papier-mâché tank that was a little better, but still nowhere near the 200 gallons the Thunderbolt needed. Since they were now required to use that standard mount and the Lockheed-type tanks, the P-47's wings had to be redesigned to take drop tanks. That took time, which is why you don't see P-47s with wing-mounted drop tanks until late 1943. When you see a belly tank on a Thunderbolt in 1943, certainly mid-1943, it's usually the way too small 75-gallon tank, except, of course, in the Pacific, where units beyond the reach of the Bomber Mafia designed and built their own 200-gallon tank in theater and used that with great success. I have a video about that, so I won't get into it here. At this point, it should be very clear that the P-38 got drop tanks relatively early, not because of the Bomber Mafia, but rather in spite of it. We can thank some low-ranking officers, specifically Ben Kelsey, for risking his career to make this happen. I mentioned earlier about Hap Arnold painting himself into a corner by suggesting that U.S. planes could possibly be flown to Europe. That was in March of 1942, and this forced his hand, and he had to authorize a range extension program, which he did the very next month. As seen in this document, the focus of the range extension program was to increase ferrying range, not to provide bomber escort. That's important to understand because some uninformed individuals in the comments section will often point to this program as evidence that the USAAF really was trying to provide escorts for the heavy bombers. They were not. At this point, they were still true believers in the unescorted heavies. As a part of the range extension program, there was an effort to increase internal fuel capacity of the fighters in addition to drop tanks. This was done for the P-38, P-47, and once it got going, for the Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang. The Thunderbolt required quite a bit of work to make this happen. Republic could have taken a shortcut and put the tank aft of the cockpit. In fact, that was done as a field mod in the Pacific Theater. However, it caused a weight and balance issue. Republic did it right, redesigned the plane, and put more internal fuel into the P-47, starting with the bubble-top -25 models. But it took time, and these were not rolling off the assembly line until around February of 1944, and not in service in Europe until May of that year. Over at North American, they added an 85-gallon tank aft of the cockpit of their Merlin-powered P-51. CG issues be damned, there was a war on. The pilots would just have to deal with it. This actually worked pretty well. The pilot would just burn fuel out of this tank before combat. At least that's what he would do in most cases. Lockheed had the best solution here. The early P-38s had intercoolers in the leading edges of the wing to cool down the hot air coming out of the turbochargers. As the plane gained horsepower, these couldn't keep up with the demand. They had to be moved to the chin area of the engine nacelles, which is a change you can easily see on the P-38J model and later. The J model represents the point at which P-38s became really good airplanes. They came out with the J model in August of 1943. Lockheed increased the internal fuel capacity of the J and later models by putting fuel tanks in the leading edges where the old intercoolers had been. These two extra tanks added another 110 gallons to the P-38's internal fuel capacity, bringing it up to 410 gallons. Sometimes this is listed as 416 as it is here. With a pair of 165-gallon drop tanks, the P-38's range was massive. Plus, they could carry those 300-gallon tanks, which on some occasions they did. Using the same basic comparison methods we used earlier, let's look at range as compared with the Mustang and Thunderbolt. I'll start here with the maximum ranges from the manuals on internal fuel alone. Keep in mind this subtracts some fuel for taxi, takeoff, and initial climb. 40 gallons for the P-38 and the P-47, 29 gallons for the P-51. I'll take the numbers from the manuals and then put them in the graph for an easy comparison. As you can see, the Lightning has a range in this case of 1,220 miles. The Mustang has the most with 1,270, and the Thunderbolt D25 has 895. The Lightning and Mustang have comparable range, but the Lightning with this much internal fuel was out in August of 43, way before the P-51 with its extended range fuselage tank. However, these are just numbers straight from the manual, showing how far the plane can go on internal fuel. For bomber escort duty, what usually matters is how far the plane can go after it drops its tanks and fights for 20 minutes or so. More often than not, this was the scenario that ultimately limited escort range because the plane needs to get back home after the dogfight. So let's take a look at those numbers. I'll assume war emergency power for 5 minutes and military power for 15 minutes for all three airplanes. In this situation, the P-38 will burn 112 gallons. Remember, in this scenario, we burned 40 gallons after takeoff, but on a long flight with the drop tanks, most of that will be returned to the internal fuel tanks because unmetered fuel from the injection carburetors goes back to an internal tank with all three of these airplanes. Still, I'm going to consider that 40 gallons for milling around the landing pattern and reserves, so that leaves us with 258 gallons. With that fuel, it can go a massive 866 miles. The Thunderbolt will use 90 gallons for its 20 minutes of combat. That leaves it with 624 miles of escort range, still easily enough to escort to Berlin or most anywhere in Germany. The P-51's case is interesting. We know it used only 29 gallons for taxi, takeoff, and initial climb, but before combat, due to the center of gravity issue, P-51s would typically use up all but 20 gallons in the fuselage tank. Thus, once it drops the externals, it has only 175 gallons to fight for 20 minutes and then to get home. Subtract the 52 gallons it will use for the 20 minutes of combat, and we're down to 123 gallons for that return trip. That gives us a range of 656 miles, which is good, slightly more than the Thunderbolt, but not as good as the P-38J. Now, the Mustang does have the highest cruise speed at these maximum range power settings, but even if the Lightning is throttled up so it's going faster than the Mustang under these conditions, the Lightning still has more range. What if we add drop tanks into the mix? All of these planes could carry enough drop tanks to carry them out to these distances, so that's not a problem. But what if you need to go farther on something like what was called a shuttle mission, where you go out past the point where you can return to base, fight, and continue on in more or less the same direction, and press on to another base in the distance? Both P-38s and P-51s flew these types of missions. Drop tanks have a big effect on shuttle mission range. Both the P-47 and the P-38 would routinely carry twin 165-gallon drop tanks and on occasion would carry 300-gallon drop tanks. The P-51s carried 75-gallon drop tanks in nearly all combat missions over Europe. This is the only drop tank listed in the P-51 Pilot's Manual from April of 1944. There was a 108-gallon paper tank made by the British. This was a good tank, but it did not extend the Mustang's range as much as you might think because it had higher drag than the 75-gallon teardrop tanks. The Pilot's Manual for the P-51 Mustang does not have range data for the British 108s, making estimations pretty tricky. There was also a 110-gallon tank for the P-51. These are mentioned in the August of 1945 manual. These were not used much because they were on the limit of what the Mustang's wing structure could support. There isn't any range data for these tanks in the pilot's manuals either. I don't think the 110s were used on P-51s in Europe. I could be wrong about that, but I looked through hundreds of pictures and I could not find a single example. Keep in mind, it's a bit hard to tell as both 75s and 110s have the same diameter and overall shape. The 110 is just longer. So if you're looking at the tank from a certain angle, there's no way to tell the difference. Often pictures of Mustangs with 108-gallon British paper tanks are mislabeled as having US 110s. These are very different tanks as the 110s were metal teardrop types with relatively low drag. The 75-gallon tanks on the Mustang are about equivalent to the 165s on a Lightning, both in terms of range extension and frequency of use. In these configurations, the P-51 has slightly more range, but then we have the dual 300 option for the bigger fighters, which puts the P-38 all the way out to 2,200 miles. I don't have range data for the P-47 Thunderbolt with the big 300 or 310-gallon tanks, but they were used on the plane. You can calculate escort ranges many different ways, different altitudes, speeds, drop tank configurations, but no matter how you do it, the P-38, J-15, and later models have about as much range as a P-51, and in many cases more. You may be able to edge the 51 ahead slightly in some situations by assuming full internal fuel once the external tanks are dropped. That wasn't the normal way to use the P-51 Mustang, but it was done on some occasions. Sometimes you'll see 800 or 850 mile escort radius numbers for the P-51, and that's how they're getting it. Ultimately, it doesn't matter which airplane has the most range, the 51 or the 38. That's not really the point here. The point is that the standard Bomber Mafia narrative that only the P-51 had enough range to escort deep into Germany is false. The P-38 could and did do it. It's also worth pointing out that the 5th Air Force P-38s and P-47Ds flew escort missions with a larger combat radius than the P-51 Mustang ever did. The Lightning and Thunderbolts flew escort missions to Balikpapan with a radius of well over 800 miles. Now, I'm sure if the 5th Air Force had Mustangs at the time, they would have used them on that mission, but they didn't have them. The greatest radius I can find for a Mustang escort mission is about 700 miles each way. The very existence of the P-38 is damaging to the standard Bomber Mafia narrative that there was no plane with enough range to escort deep into Germany until the P-51 showed up. In fact, it's more than damaging. It just destroys that narrative, which is why typically they don't talk about P-38 range. By ignoring the P-38, as they often do, and focusing on the P-47 with no drop tanks or a single little tank, they can argue that no fighter could do the job until the 51 showed up. It's not a valid argument, as the lack of proper drop tanks for the Thunderbolt was the Bomber Mafia's fault. They created the problem and then used the problem as an excuse for the large number of losses incurred by the U.S. heavy bombers over Europe. Furthermore, they then covered up their actions by pushing a false narrative. For example, this official chart for the P-47 Thunderbolt shows an early version before the increased internal fuel capacity and with a drop tank configuration that's nowhere near the P-47's maximum. Why not show a P-47 D-25 with dual 165s under the wings? Because that would damage their narrative. It was much the same with the P-38 Lightning. Here's that chart from the same document. Notice it doesn't show the range for a P-38 with dual 165s. Why not? Again, it's about pushing the false narrative. To top it off, they show an 850-mile escort range for a P-51 with dual 108s, which is absolutely a best-case dream world scenario. In order to do that, it has to fight with a full fuselage tank, which is going to be a problem if up against any serious Luftwaffe opposition. To sum up, the Lightning had its drop tanks in spite of the Bomber Mafia, thanks to Kelsey, Goddard, Johnson, and some others. All three of those guys put their careers at some risk to do this, especially Kelsey and Goddard. The Lightning was set up for drop tanks before the 8th Air Force started bombing Germany, and could have escorted to most of the targets in 1943, including most importantly Schweinfurt. When the J-15 model showed up, they could have easily escorted all the way to Berlin and beyond, anywhere P-51s could go, and way before the Merlin P-51s were available. Plus, Lightnings could be flown to Europe from the U.S., so they could get them there fairly quickly. In fact, they were flying F-model Lightnings across the Atlantic in mid-1942. The J models would not have been there for the first Schweinfurt raid, but the G and H models easily could have been there and done the job. So if they had Lightnings, why didn't they send them over to Europe to escort the heavies in 1943? First of all, the Bomber Mafia's mindset did not see the need for long-range escort fighters. This is from General Eaker, who at one point was head of the 8th Air Force, and the date here is August 1942. If you're listening to this and can't see the screen, I'll paraphrase it for you. He thought that bombers could be operated just fine beyond the range of fighter protection. He also felt that there were very few worthwhile targets within the range of fighter protection anyway. He did concede that fighters would be valuable in getting bombers through the German fighter belt. That was the concentrated belt of Luftwaffe fighters based near the English Channel at the time. This whole statement is particularly characteristic of Ira Eaker. Any possible stance you can think of on an 8th Air Force issue, you can probably find a document in which Eaker takes that stance. Sometimes he takes multiple positions on an issue within the same document. This gives him plausible deniability, something everyone in the Bomber Mafia who made it up to 3-star general or above was really good at. That's why I say you have to look and see what the Bomber Mafia guys actually did, not just what they said or wrote. In October of 1942, Eaker really doubled down on the unescorted bomber idea, saying that he was confident U.S. bombers could operate without fighter protection anywhere over Germany. In December of 42, there was a meeting between Generals Spaatz, Eaker, and Doolittle. All of these guys were 2-star generals, with sort of an odd exception for Karl Spaatz. World War II military ranks sometimes have some odd anomalies. Spaatz was a 2-star general, but it was a temporary rank while he was in command of the 8th. He was then superseded by Eaker. Spaatz's permanent rank at the time was full colonel, that is, until his next assignment shortly after, and then he was bumped up to a 3-star general, lieutenant general. Spaatz and Eaker were both hardcore bomber mafia. Ira Eaker co-wrote a book with Hap Arnold in the 1930s, and a large section of it was devoted to explaining how bombers will decide future wars and why fighters and anti-aircraft guns will be ineffective at stopping them. In 1942, they didn't see much need for fighters, and certainly not long-range escort fighters. Doolittle, on the other hand, was in charge of the U.S. 12th Air Force in Africa. Like nearly every other theater commander, he wanted those P-38s, and since there was no pushback from Spaatz or Eaker, he got them. So at a time when the Lightning was the only fighter which could escort into Germany, Eaker and Spaatz sent them off to Africa with the approval of Hap Arnold. This is a prime example of why we need to look at what they actually did, not just talk about what they said. Now, in June of 43, Eaker says he thinks the P-38 would be the best choice for bomber escort, but he still doesn't send for them. He has P-47s, but he hasn't made drop tanks a priority. More correctly, he made them his 4th priority. Some sources say they were his 6th priority. In any case, it was effectively no priority at all because drop tanks were not coming to the P-47s in Europe through official channels at this point in any significant numbers. Ira Eaker's actual priority at this time was the YB-40 in accordance with the Bomber Mafia's belief system. Even after the second disastrous Schweinfurt raid, Eaker said, and again I'm paraphrasing here, but he said that when it's all added up, the bomber losses will be far outweighed by the destruction they brought to the enemy. It wasn't. Soon after this, everyone, even the most hardcore Bomber Mafia members, woke up and smelled the coffee. Now they knew they needed long-range escort fighters, and all of a sudden drop tank production shot up almost overnight. P-38s were being sent to Europe, followed very shortly by the new Merlin-powered P-51s, which of course had drop tanks. However, at this point, a lot of U.S. lives had been lost due to unescorted bombers. There were careers to be saved and butts to be covered, and the Bomber Mafia was very good at that. Hap Arnold, Karl Spaatz, Ira Eaker came out just fine. All of them made it to 4-star general, although Eaker's was honorary. Hap Arnold was actually a 5-star in both the Army and post-war in the new U.S. Air Force. So the story they pushed was that there was simply no fighter in the U.S. inventory that could escort the bombers until the P-51 showed up. But that's simply not true. The P-38s had been there and been available all along. The various books I used for the screenshots are in the Patreon section. Please consider joining. Also like and subscribe. You know the drill. Now, none of this is to say that the P-38 was the ultimate fighter. It was good, but the P-51 was a better choice for work over Europe. However, the P-51 with the Merlin wasn't available in 43. The Lightning was. I'm sure someone in the comments will say, but the Lightning had all of these problems and wasn't any good over Europe. So I'll preemptively respond to some of that. The Lightning did have some problems. The early versions had poor heaters, and for some reason they had a single generator electrical system, and the ailerons got quite heavy at high speeds, and it also had a very low Mach limit. All of these problems were eventually addressed, except the low Mach limit, which stayed, but they added dive recovery flaps with the later J and subsequent models, and that problem was at least somewhat mitigated. As for the low Mach limit, U.S. fighter doctrine in 1943 was to stay with the bombers anyway. Thus, if a 109 or 190 dove away, the P-38s weren't really supposed to follow. If they chose to, yes, the Luftwaffe fighters would pull away in the dive, but depending on just which versions we're talking about, the 38s might eventually catch up. There were also reliability problems with the P-38 over Europe. This seems to be related to the fuel and probably the way the planes were being maintained and operated. These problems were unique to the European theater, and the normal reason given is that it was cold over Europe. However, Lightnings routinely operated at 20,000, 25,000 feet and higher in other theaters, and at those altitudes, the temperatures are pretty darn cold everywhere and vary less by region than you might think. Here is a chart showing temperatures at 24,000 feet over Europe and down to North Africa. As you can see, up at that altitude, even the southern portions of Italy, as well as the southern portions of the Mediterranean Sea, have temperatures that are about the same as those over Germany. The reliability in the European theater was not simply due to temperature. In any case, I can't give the Bomber Mafia a pass on this because they sent the P-38s away before they knew of these reliability issues over Europe. You can't argue that they made a conscious decision not to use the plane for a reason that they were not even conscious of. Plus, I think it's reasonable that had they started using them in late 1942, those reliability issues would have been sorted out pretty quickly and in time for the heavy escorting work needed in 1943. What about the other problems? The poor heater, heavy aileron, single generator in the earlier models? Well, I ask you, and I do want to hear your thoughts on this in the comments. Do you seriously think it's more desirable to lose 60 bombers in one day than to possibly lose a few P-38s or to have pilots that are uncomfortably cold for a few hours? I say, of course not. The reason the P-38s were not used in Europe had nothing to do with the flaws of the airplane and everything to do with the Bomber Mafia doctrine, and that's backed up by statements from the Bomber Mafia members themselves. Some supporters of the Bomber Mafia narrative will argue that this whole thing is just a theory that I made up. First of all, that's not a valid argument supporting the Bomber Mafia. It's not an argument based on facts or historical evidence. Furthermore, it's not even true. I didn't make this up. I'm far from the first one to talk about it. Bodie talks about the development of the P-38 drop tanks in his book and makes it very clear that the project was on the shoulders of Benjamin Kelsey and with no support from Hap Arnold. In fact, he was putting his own career at risk by doing it. In this book, From the Center for Air Force History, written by Richard G. Davis, you will find this statement. Mr. Davis covers this subject pretty extensively. You can pause and read this page if desired. It hits pretty hard. Over on the Chicago Boys website, Trent Telenko has covered the Bomber Mafia debacle quite a bit as well. Kirk Hunsinger wrote a thesis called The Invincible Bomber, in which he talks about the failure to give escort fighters any sort of priority, even in 1941. Perhaps most importantly, we have William R. Emerson, a P-47 pilot in World War II. He had a PhD in history and taught military history at Yale. Mr. Emerson gave a talk at the U.S. Air Force Academy in 1962, the transcript of which can be found today on the Air Force Academy website. Here is an excerpt from the speech. He talks about the Army Air Force going in the wrong direction with the YB-40 and dragging their feet on drop tanks. He goes on to talk about Hap Arnold waking up and complaining that in the Pacific Theater, General Kenny was able to get drop tanks up and running in only 2 months, yet it was taking forever in the U.S. The truth, of course, is General Kenny got a prototype tank running in 2 days. It was produced in decent numbers and into the New Guinea area for service within 2 months. I have a whole video about that. That story, more than anything else, shows just how simple putting a drop tank on a P-47 really was once you ignore all the roadblocks and just make it out of steel, make it non-self-sealing, and configure it for flight at altitude by whatever means you need to. The fact that Hap Arnold is complaining here about the time it takes to develop drop tanks when he himself had been the primary roadblock to drop tank production for the previous few years is almost comical. At least it would be if it didn't cause a huge loss of men and machines. Of course, there are those who still believe the P-51 range myth. I had a debate right here on YouTube with an author on this very subject. I encourage you to watch it. The debate was with Bill Marshall, who is a good author and has an excellent book on the P-51 Mustang, which I have read and I do recommend. In fact, the range topic is one of the few topics we disagree on. I put the blame squarely on the Bomber Mafia due to a combination of intent and incompetence. He puts it elsewhere. You can watch the debate here to see his side. I'll put the link in the description. That's all for now. You can click on either of these things that are on the screen. One is a playlist of P-38 videos. Another is a video covering the various problems and solutions the P-38s had during the war. Goodbye and have a great day.